let's move on to our next person here. The nun, also known as the prioress, also known as the abbess, but the nun is fine. Uh, a lil nun, perhaps, depending on your spelling of Littlein from Lord of the Flies. Let's see. Here's our nun. And with the prioress there, what Chaucer means is that someone who is in charge of an abbey. So, um, where you would have a bunch of monks, if they were men, or a bunch of nuns, if they were women, who would live together in a communal life. And the prioress would be the one who was in charge. And so here, we want to pay attention to this is an example of a light satire by Chaucer. He is not going to attack her too hard. But let's pay attention and think about. So we just heard all the nice things he said about the parson. Let's see what he says here about the nun. There also was a nun, a prioress, her way of smiling very simple and coy. Her greatest oath was only by St. Loy, and she was known as Madame Eglantine, and well she sang a service, with a fine intoning through her nose, as was most seemly, and she spoke daintily in French, extremely, after the school of Stratford, at Bow. French in the Paris style she did not know. At meat her manners were well taught withal. No morsel from her lips did she let fall, nor dipped her fingers in the sauce too deep, but she could carry a morsel up, and keep the smallest drop from falling on her breast. For courtliness she had a special zest, and she would wipe her upper lip so clean that not a trace of grease was to be seen. Upon the cup, when she had drunk to eat, she reached a hand sedately for the meat. She certainly was very entertaining, pleasant and friendly in her ways, and straining to counterfeit a courtly kind of grace, a stately bearing befitting to her place, and to seem dignified in all her dealings. As for her sympathies and tender feelings, she was so charitably solicitous, she used to weep if she but saw a mouse caught in a trap, if it were dead or bleeding, and she had little dogs she would be feeding with roasted flesh or milk or fine white meat, and bitterly she wept if one were dead, or someone took a stick and made it smart. She was all sentiment and a tender heart. Her veil was gathered in a seemly way. Her nose was elegant, her eyes glass gray. Her mouth was very small but soft and red. Her forehead certainly was fair of spread, almost a span across the brows, I own. She was indeed by no means undergrown. Her cloak, I noticed, had a graceful charm. She wore a coral trinket on her arm. A set of beads, the gaudy streaked in green, whence hung a golden brooch of the brightest sheen, on which there first was graven a crowned A, and lower, Amor vincit omnia, meaning, as we see down the bottom here, love conquers all. So let's go back and look here. The biggest difference between the nun and the prioress, the biggest difference between the parson and the prioress. Well, the parson we heard about, okay, well, he follows the gospel and he's always helping people and he's giving his own money and he's visiting, and if they're sick, he's there and he's such a great example. And what do we hear from the nun? Well, she was a great singer. She sang a service. And, she spoke daintily in French. Oh, and she had great manners. She had a special zest for courtliness. Well, that doesn't sound like maybe the most important things for someone who would be serving the church. essentially what Chaucer's doing here is what's called damning by faint praise. What do we mean by that? It means that you give someone what is technically a compliment, but it's what you don't say that leads to it's almost like an implied critique. Like, let's say you're talking to someone who's married, and you say, "Oh, well, tell me what's the best thing about your spouse?" And they say, like, "Well, they make a lot of money." It's like, "Oh, well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, I guess that's a compliment. It's nice to have money." Spoiler alert. But um, it's kind of a, I don't know, red flag when that's the first thing you say about somebody, or maybe the only thing you say about somebody. And so technically, what he's doing here is giving her compliments. There's nothing we can look at here and be like, well, he's roasting her right here. He's not. He's not attacking her very hard at all. But it's almost that what he doesn't say is the critique here. If we didn't know that she was a prioress, if we didn't know that she was a nun, we couldn't really figure it out based on this. It seems, in fact, that the way her acting, her manners, her, you know, cleanliness when she's dining, and these little dogs that always follow her around that she's feeding, she seems more like a noblewoman here than a member of a religious order. And like, she's not a jerk. Like, she cries if one of her little dogs die. Um, she seems to be, as Chaucer says here, all sentiment and tender heart. But where is the other stuff? The stuff we got with the parson. It's not here with the prioress. And so, as he ends here talking about her fancy jewelry, this belief in like love conquers all, she's almost depicted more as a noblewoman than as a nun, which wouldn't be a problem if she was a noblewoman, but she's not. She's a prioress, she's someone in charge of a bunch of other nuns. And so this would be an example of a lighter satire where Chaucer is not really attacking her too much, but is sort of, again, damning by faint praise, or omitting, what you would think you would say about a nun here. Next up,